Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Alex, I hand it over to you when you're ready.
Thank you.
Okay, we can see your screen, and you've just got rid of the ones on the side, and now I think it's just the way you'd like it.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for leading the charge here. And also, I want to thank all the panelists here who make this such an important meeting. We're representing most of the continents around the planet today, and there's very good reasons for that, because this is happening around the world simultaneously, and everyone around the world needs to know about that. So there is no seasonal adjustment that needs to be made here. So we're trying to bring forward the technology as we know it today. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science. Our topic is the Intermediate Inertia series titled Foodies. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It's February the 16th of 2025. This is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So, as I said, we're into the Intermediate Inertia series, and of course, this is an extension of other intermediate series, but please remember that these are just really basic teachings, and we try and add a little bit more so that we can move ahead, but not so far that we lose the newcomers as they come in, because for whatever reason, they've either not had the opportunity or they have been oblivious to everything that's going on. So last week we talked about four-wheelers, and if you wonder why are we talking about four-wheelers, because there was a paradigm shift, an industrial revolution. We went from cartwheels to pneumatic wheels. We went through horse-drawn carriages to internal combustion engines. And today we're going to be talking about us as foodies, because it is all about us. We were the four-wheelers, and we are the foodies. And we are stuck on this hesitancy highway, which is the lowest energy state. But when I say we're stuck here, we're looking for heaven. But you know what? We are in heaven. It's just that some people like to mess things up. They don't want to clean up after themselves. So here we are at the frontier crossroads now. And of course, we love our chuck wagon tailgate parties. We just had a major event last week with the Super Bowl very special occasion for a variety of reasons. And not the least of which, of course, was the game itself, which was pretty exciting if you had some money on the game. But here we are, searching for outer space. And as we see with the cover of book number 3, things are kind of splitting up. And, you know, as foodies, we are looking to get in our four-wheelers and travel, but we need these drive-in stops on the plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And that's where the first problem comes in. We're seeking our little pie in the sky. But what we need to do is we need to enlarge our schemes. We've been scheming to captivate our little pie and forgetting about the rest of the pie, which is ours also. But when we say it's ours to enjoy, it's ours to use, but it's not ours to dominate. So we like our drive-ins. We feel that we are more mobile. And of course, it's become an integral part of our society where we have drive-in restaurants, drive-in coffee shops. We don't have many drive-in theaters left. That was very romantic. We do have drive-in oil change places. And of course, the most important thing, the drive-in bank. But the interesting thing about a drive-in is that when we look at our body, that is a foodie containment. And when we look at a car body, that is a four-wheeler containment. So when we go to a drive-in, we have to take our body, which is a foodie containment, and we have to put it within a four-wheeler car body containment. So we put a containment within a containment. And that's how we get around. But let's all remember, that's not how we got here. We didn't come in a limousine, unless you call Mama a limousine. Maybe that's not a bad description. But when we look at the books of Marin Tavakoli-Kesh, what he shows is our limousine was created. We're looking at the universal order of creation of matters as described in book number 1. And it discusses the plasma science and the plasma matter and how it comes together. But in order for it to come together, it has to come from somewhere. And once it comes together, it has to go somewhere. So in book number 2, we see the structure of the light. And then, of course, we talk about book number 3, which is the origin of the universe. And if the coming together of the matter is the creation of the universe, then what is the difference between that and the origin of the universe? And that is probably one of the biggest riddles that we've had to overcome. And many of us wondered if book number 3 should have been book number 1. But I think as we all start to understand that life is working in a broader scheme. And as such, we need to think in terms of a broader scheme. As we see in the 365th One Planet, One Nation, One Race for Justice and World Peace, brought to you by Rick Crammond and the members of the Universal Council, who at this point in time seem to be exclusively from the Universal Council of Earth. But, you know, when we talk about the Universal Council, and since the Earth is within the universe, we understand that there are other members of the Universal Council who may or may not be present or have yet to come. And you never know, they might have had to stop at the drive-in for a little bit of food supplementation. On our way here, we have been given rules, and so we see the 10 commandments and the completion with the missing commandments, and so that rounds it out to a nice a round number of 24. 24, 2 dozen, and that makes the case. So, as I said, we're looking for the plasma highway. We have to put things in perspective. So, where is the plasma highway in relationship to all of this? So, well, first of all, we've examined the transmission highway, which is the lowest energy state, and we see the frequency, pressure, and heat are involved with that. And then there's a capability of going to the transition highway, which is kind of an intermediary step. But, you know, as you come to that intermediary step, you can go left or right, can't you? It's just like coming to a T intersection. You may have come to the end of the road going forward, but you have to make a turn. And which way do you go? Well, one way is to actually go into the transmutation highway. And then from there, well, the universe is your oyster, as they say. So what we're seeing is that the connection to this universal oyster is the carbon inertia highway. And so, as I said, this is part of the intermediate inertia series. And so we see that the inertia is the coming together of two fields. And so the product of those coming together is one field. And that one field in the transmission field is carbon-12 plus carbon-12. And it has to be because when we look at the other fields, they all have a case of 24. So carbon-14 plus carbon-10, one case, carbon-16 plus carbon-8, another case. But what happens is that the ratios change. So in the transmission stage, we have a 1-to-1 ratio. But in the transition stage, the carbon-14 to the carbon-10 is a 1.4-to-1 ratio. So the ratio has increased. And then if we step up again, it has now doubled from where we started. Carbon-16 to carbon-8, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So the key point here is that we can change the energy state. We can change the ratio. But the aggregate of the inertia fields remains the same in terms of mass. So it's always 24. Now, in this case, we say it's 24, and that's the number we choose. But the number really is relevant. What is relevant is that the mass remains the same in all three of these levels, and therefore the rules remain the same. And this is the thing that we want to understand. When we're looking at things, we need to understand, are we just seeing the reflection, or are we suffering from an illusion? You know, and here we are after all these years pioneering America. And of course, we discovered it in 1492, was it? I don't know, I can't remember. I wasn't there. But the people who were there told us that that's what happened. So we have to really understand which way we're looking at things. And therefore, we run into another problem where the perception, it all depends on where you're looking at. So we asked the question last week is how big is large? Because, you know, when things are big, they're really big. But how big exactly are they? And so we find there's a discrepancy in understanding the nuclear forces. So we see the weak nuclear forces are far apart, and the far nuclear forces are strong because they involve planets. They involve big things, really big things. Well, how big? Well, Earth big. That's pretty big. But wait a second. Jupiter's a lot bigger. So Jupiter is also big. So would you say that Earth is big and Jupiter is big, which would give you the false notion that they are both the same size? Well, the thing about the strong nuclear forces, as we see, is that they are near, because we're dealing with the atomic forces. So, but because the atomic forces are so tiny, the nuclear forces that are near are actually weak nuclear forces. So we have an anomaly here where the relativity of whether a nuclear force is strong or weak is determined by whether it's near or far. But how far is it? And is there no interaction between near nuclear forces and far nuclear forces? Well, we have nuclear forces on Earth, and we have nuclear forces on other planets. And the relationship between those atomic forces and the planet are similar in nature to the atomic forces on Earth and the Earth planet. So if the relationships are the same, then the force between the Earth and, let's say, Mars, for instance, is the same as the force from Mars to Earth. And the point of the matter is that the discussion on strong and weak nuclear forces becomes redundant. And for some people, this is quite controversial. But when we are looking at light, and we say, let there be light, then we're seeing the light. And when that light is white, we know that that is every color. And so when we're seeing the blackness, so that is no light, because the blackness is no color. So when we look at what we see and describe what we see, we only make reference to what we see with the light and in color. So the things that we can't see, I guess they don't exist. But if what we can't see doesn't exist, what makes it that what we can see does exist? And it's not the first time that there isn't any accounting for this. So as we have been nickel and diming our understanding of physics, and when I say we, the collective of the human population, there are those who don't care, there are those who don't understand, and there are those who do care. And even in that lot, there are those who don't understand. But I think we all know that when we come home, it would really be nice to have a welcome mat out. And since this is what we're talking about, bringing peace and prosperity to this planet, it is hard to understand the opposition. Somehow the welcome mat is turned upside down. And so we deal in nickels and dimes, and we let the $100 bills fly away. So we are at the junction, what we call the plasma inertial junction. And so what that means is that there's a higher energy state, which is a product of the inertia fields. And it depends on the presence of the lower energy fields, where one low field and another low field, not necessarily the same energy state, but would create a higher energy field. And then, of course, there's the medium junction, where you have a lower field and a higher field, and the combination creates an inertia junction in the medium state. And so 1 and 1 is still more than 2. So then, of course, there's the low junction, where you have a higher field and a medium field, creating an inertia field in the lowest energy state. And it's still 1 and 1 is more than 2. So we have 3 different scenarios, low, medium, and high, and the relationship is the same, which means that the rules are the same. But now we have to look at it in 3 dimensions, because the difference between a circle and a sphere is that added dimension. And so what we see is that the equation should read 1 plus 1, not necessarily the same one, plus another one, again, not necessarily the same as the first 2 ones, and greater than 3. And we say greater than 3 because we still have the first one, the second one, and the third one. So we now have literally 3 feeding dimensions and 4 feedback dimensions. But the thing is, 1 and 1 is more than 2. That gives us an inertia field. And so the 2 feeding dimensions create the inertia field, and the inertia field, along with the feeding dimensions, create the feedback dimensions. So in fact, because we are none of those 3 dimensions, we are in a 4th dimension. We are the observer dimension. And how we justify this is with our little pi, 3.14 and a bit and a bit and a bit. And well, it's not very precise, so we're just going to fudge that. But the thing is, we can't fudge is the conservation of inertia. Excuse me. Which is part of the Maglev energy transfer states. Just give me 1 moment, please. So I'm back. And so what we're talking about is a balance of one side of the equation with the other side of the equation. But now we understand there's a low, medium, and high in terms of relativity. And so in this case, we're looking at 3 physical states, the atomic state, the nanostate, and the GaN state. And so we can literally pick whichever one we want on one side and add to it 1 on the other side and come together with the inertia field. and it would have to balance out. And so the question then becomes is how can we balance when we have different energy states? It's easy to understand if we're at the same energy state, but once we start to bring in a third dimension, and then once we start to open the opportunity there to consider that, then the results become a little bit more complex. And we don't want to be overly complex. I mean, let's face it, we're pretty simple, just give me something to eat, a case of beer, a nice car, and life is good. But, when we look at our bodies, we find that we are actually very, very complex. And our saving grace is that we, in our physicality, don't have to really look after that except to maintain it. And so, what are we maintaining? You see, with the creation of the universe, that was created for us, shall we say, on our behalf. And the universe exists from energy. And so that energy is always positive. So the charge of the energy is the direction of motion. And the energy is always in motion. And where does it go? So one thing we find that it can stay within itself as the creation of matter. But then we find that to get to that stage, it had to come. And then once it comes, then it has to go. And to get there, it has to balance off. And so what we're saying, it can balance off in the physical state, or it can transcend the various energy states and still balance off. And how do we know that? Well, because we were born. And we were born using these very rules. So our universe was created from energy. Our planet was created from energy. And we were created from energy. But there's a sequence, you see, is that the earth was created before us, because we can't get here unless here is here already. And so how did we get here? And so we find that energy fields have to come together in what we call an inertia zone. But the way we see it, because in the plasma science, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. Whereas in the physical science, the higher strength eats the weaker strength. And so this becomes a point of conflict. But this point of conflict in many ways is also a binding zone. And so one way to look at a point of conflict is when you have common enemies. And we seem to tend to look for our common enemies, like we look for our problems. But it's an acquired way of looking at things, because the higher strength eats the weaker strength. But if we see that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, then those that we feed, we know are our friends. And so that binding zone is not looking for conflict. It's looking for a resolution. And of course, it's looking for the welfare. And we all need this welfare, because that welfare comes from energy binding. And our welfare is our welfare, and it's self-serving. And we get that. We got that when we got here. We had it when we arrived. We have it today. But for some reason, we are stealing it from others. In other words, our self-serving energy binding is done at the expense of others who depend on that energy binding. And they need it for their self-serving purpose. So either it'll be a point of conflict with you, or they will just pass the conflict on to someone else. So the feeding cycle continues. And so that creates a lot of tension. And so this tensity relationship in the plasma science is a balance between the magnetical gravitational fields, which we call a maggrav, but it is not in total balance. It is balanced in terms of an equality, but it is not equal in terms of field strength, because the maggrav is the inertia field that balances out that particular field strength, which we call inertia. But there has to be a reference to some environment. And so here we have the scientific community trying to understand the awake state of the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. And then you look at the spiritual community representing the dream state, where they talk about the nebulous spirit and nebulous soul and how things work without rationalizing how the spirit is the motor of the soul, because we know that as we get into our cars, we are containment going into a containment. So we are literally the motor of the second containment. But what we see is if we extend our scheme of operation, then we could add to the knowledge. And this is how the plasma science adds to the knowledge, because it brings the scientific responsibility and the spiritual responsibility together. And then the question becomes is, what is the rate of change? So the question then becomes is, who's putting out the welcome mat? And who's locking the door? And why would you want to lock a door to peace and prosperity? So we see the problem with humanity's civilization because we all have the same story of the Great Flood. But even though we share that story, even though we share this planet, we are all individual. We have our own race. And so we have a contention between the races. But interestingly enough, it's like saying one family against another family. But within a family, there's also contention. And we see that in wars, in politics, in romance, brother against brother, sister against sister, children against the parents. And you say, what kind of family is that? And then we find that in many ways our society is breeding that. And how can we change that? How can we reverse that? Well, all we have to do is look at what happens when we leave. And we find that, wow, the earth doesn't really miss us much, because we can take the elements of the earth, combine them together in the cups of life, use the knowledge that we have gained with respect to the lowest energy state of physicality, the higher energy state of the monatomic science, and manufacture the higher still state of the GANS science. And then we find that this GANS science is representative of our physicality, the two main components that we have. And we discovered that through the creation of a lot of different GANSes. And we find that they're all an inertia state of a combination. And so we have CO2 GANS and calcium carbonate GANS and copper and zinc GANS, water and amino acid GANS, and even gold GANS. But the thing about it is that we have a contention. We have a containment. And we need to be fed. And so we disregard how we've been getting fed by the plasma, and we focus only on what we're getting from others. And so we wonder, are we satisfied or are we hungry? And what needs to be fulfilled? Is it the one-track cup of the emotion? Is it the one-track cup of the physicality? Or is it the one-track inertia cup of the emotional physical combination, which we call the cup of man? And that, in simple terms, is one and one is more than two. But what if we add the cup of soul? Now we have 1 + 1 + 1, not the same one, but when we put it all together, well, we have more than 3 because we still have the other cups. So we have the 3 cups plus an inertia field of the combination. And then we have to work with that field. And so we find that the way our brain is structured, we have a left side and a right side, not the same side. And they work together to create the cup of the universe within our head. And that interacts with the inertia of the mind. So the inertia of the mind is the manifestation of the soul of physicality. And so it too becomes an inertia field. But is it an inertia field of just the left and the right side of the brain? Or is it an inertia field of the soul of the man interacting with the soul of the earth? Because if you're going to go somewhere in physicality, that physicality has to be there. And that physicality is the earth. And it is only once we have that physicality, then we can manifest the physicality of man. And so there we have the inertia field combination of the physicality of the man, the physicality of the earth, and the soul of the physicality. And that all becomes an inertia field feeding back to the inertia of the mind. So when we talk about inertia, it's a generic term. It's just like saying, I have a car. You don't know what color it is. You don't know what model it is. And so when we look at all the earth ganses, we find that it's like a grand central station. All of these ganses are on the earth, which means that the earth itself is a combination of all of these ganses. And when we say all of these ganses, all means all, because all of Earth is combined from all of the ganses. You can't have a part of Earth not being created from a part that doesn't exist. So everything on Earth is a creation of something that exists and includes all the ganses. So that brings us back to our fundamental questions, which we're discussing in this intermediate series. We have identified what we call elemental protons. And so we have assigned a number of protons for each element. And then we have added some numbers of neutron. We are led to believe initially that for every proton there is a neutron. But if we don't have a neutron, which we have a specific case like that, then we have to question, is the absence of a neutron a neutron? Or in the absence of a neutron, is it really that a proton is a neutron? And so that becomes the exception. Every element has a neutron, except the one element that doesn't have a neutron, but it has a proton. And then conversely, every element has a proton. So if the question is, can an element exist without a neutron? It seems that indeed it is possible, because hydrogen does not have a neutron. Unless in the absence of a neutron, then the proton is actually a neutron. It's kind of like you have a boss and the boss leaves. Who's the boss now? So we have a new boss in the absence of the big boss. Without the big boss, do you exist? So we look at the periodic table of prejudice, because all of these elements are in specific places and specific locations on the planet, but they are all part of Earth space. And so they comprise all the details that we need to understand our Earth space. And they're all organized very, very nicely in numerical sequence based on protons. And then we find that the ratio of the neutrons to protons changes as the elements become more dense. So how does that sit with the principal matter understanding, where we have the PM ticks, which are magnetical, and they come together and they bring together the antimatter, dark matter, and matter gen, and they convert it into a plasma gen, and then that plasma gen has to interact with the field of the Earth, and then that creates an inertia field where we have this gravitational maggrav, which we call our matter state. And that matter state, well, it can be physical or it can be plasmatic, but it is still matter state. And so if the higher plasma feeds the weaker plasma, then when we're referencing the plasma state of the matter plasma, that would be the higher state. And when we're referencing the physical state of the matter plasma, that would be the lower energy state. And the problem for us is we can't see the plasma state. We can't touch it. We can't see it. So we don't acknowledge that it is feeding us. So we become feedback dominant because we think the physical state is feeding us. So that's a discussion, you see, because when we look at the neutron mass and we find that the neutron mass changes with the density as we progress through the periodic table of prejudice, we find that the neutron to proton ratio is variable. It isn't just a fudge where we have, a little bit left over and we just kind of sweep that under the carpet. It literally is a variable ratio. And so the neutron mass itself is variable. And the question then becomes is, when would a neutron be a proton? Well, we could equally ask is, when would a proton be a neutron? We'll have to discuss that another time, because in the beginning, we know that the neutron came before the atom and the PM tick, because the neutron itself, as we saw in the creation of the universe, split up into an electron-proton combination, which we call an atom. and then it created a PM tick. And so when we say, let there be light, then we understand that the light came from the darkness. And we achieved a confirmation because we couldn't see the hydrogen, but we could see a color, which was translated into an emission spectrum in color, and it was unique. And this represented the coming together of the magnetical forces of the sun, the earth, and the universe. And it came together and created a gravitational confirmation. And so the emission spectrum becomes a kind of a tracking, just like you have a delivery company giving a tracking number. So we can see the progress of this hydrogen because it's a unique fingerprint, and wherever we see it, we know that it's there, whether it's on Earth or anywhere else. And the same holds true for oxygen. The thing about oxygen, of course, it has a different fingerprint, but it all follows the same principles, and let there be light, and that becomes a gravitational confirmation. Now, when we look at hydrocarbons, and what are we talking about? Hydrogen and carbon. And we need to understand aliphatic hydrocarbons. And so these are compounds that are organic and are not aromatic. They are typically simply referred to as non-aromatic. And this includes simple carbon chains, alcohols, ketones, aldehydes, carboxylic acids, halides, alkalines, alkenes, alkynes, amines, and many others. And you can see by the diagrams here how the carbons bond together. In a single bond, a double bond, and in either case, it's just a simple bond. Now, on the other hand, an aromatic hydrocarbon is an organic molecules that do not contain any carbon-carbon double or triple bonds. Excuse me, those are aliphatic compounds. The aromatic compounds, they can be linear, branched, or cyclic. And they contain alternating single and double bonds. So it's interesting that this gives a different characteristic. Even though they're bonding according to the same principles, now we've introduced something different, something that is aromatic and something that is not aromatic. So when we look at cell membranes, and all cells have membranes, these, as we know, are made of fatty acids. And fatty acids are chains of carbon aliphatic molecules. And these aliphatic molecules are highly elastic and even fluidic, which means that they can change in appearance. Isn't that true? You have cells in your leg, you have cells in your arm. We just take those two examples and we can compare the differences. Which means all the cells come together from amino acid, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen in a star formation. And this becomes our food. And since our food is coming from protein, the creation of protein also produces water, And so the water is produced from oxygen and hydrogen, and these are two of the components in the four amino acid groups. And so we see the relationship. And water and food are two of life's essentials. And so these become part of our amino foods. And of course, just part of our structure. So it means we are amino foodies because we eat food to nourish ourselves. And so when we look at the cell's boundaries and we say, well, you know, it's kind of round. Well, yeah, but, you know, we know that it's elastic and it's fluidic. And in order to maintain its conformity, it has to have a relationship between the magnetical and gravitational fields. And we know, of course, that the neutron has to be in the core. And so we're assuming that it is a neutron. And why not? Most of the elements in the periodic tables have a neutron in the core. So when we see the plasma chain, which has a field around it, what's at the core is a gravitational neutron. Same rules, different energy state. We apply that plasma chain to the cellular action, same rules. Gravitational neutron at the core. But the magnetical gravitational balance has to be balanced by the external tensicity that holds the containment and the internal pressure that creates the three-dimensional cell formation. And then, of course, to maintain that stability, there has to be a tracking in the plasma chain that goes from the gravitational neutron and interacts with the out-tensity interaction in order to maintain its continuity. And so we understand that. We understand that science because we take our four-wheelers and we circle the wagons, right? We create a field of refuge, a field of chuck wagons. So we become four-wheeler foodies now. And we have a gravitational neutron inside the wheel and an out-tensity interaction with everything that's outside of the circle of wagons, right? So now if we look at our susceptibility and take into account the plasma science, not only do we circle the wagons with respect to our physical state, which involves the atomic, nano, and GAN state, but it involves the plasmatic state. And the plasmatic state also has a representation counterbalancing the atomic, nano, and GAN state. But there's a difference. And that difference is that it's not visible. And that is where the problem sits. Because as test dummies would kind of sit there, would say, well, you're not part of any of these three dimensions, so you get to choose three. And so the obvious three, well, that would be the three dimensions of physicality. And if that's what you choose, and it's not wrong to choose that, but if you choose that each and every time, well, you're just missing the show. So we like to consider ourselves to be fussy foodies. We like to make a choice. So, well, we'll give you a menu and choose from a selection on a menu. And don't forget to check out the soup du jour. So we have to feed our bodies. Well, the thing is, there are many different bodies. And this is important to understand because when you say body, you know, a lot of things can cross your mind. Are we talking about governing bodies or bodies of water? But, you know, there could be bodies of air, like a bag, or bodies of thought, like of a particular music, or there could be dead bodies, or just, you know, dead wood. But the thing is, all of these can be construed as part of an organic environment. But what we're talking about today is my foodie body. And my foodie body depends on the earth to feed it. Now, when I look at the cow body, the cow depends on the earth to feed it. But then, of course, there's a chicken body. And you know what? It depends on the same thing. And then there's a fish body. So the fish body doesn't so much depend on the earth, on the land, as much as it does on the water. But of course, the bottom of the water is land. And then we have this plant body, which can live in the water and it can live on the land. And it too depends on the earth space for being fed. So when we're talking about a foodie body, all of these are a foodie body. But what we're looking at is, from our point of view, my foodie body. And so the observer dimension is important. We're not going to look at it just from the physical inertia, because that's one dimension and it has a gravitational neutron. But the physical inertia is created from the field inertia of two fields. And then those fields are created from the plasma inertia of three fields. And then our humanity inertia, well, we're none of the first three, so we're in the fourth one. And from that point of view, we can look at other fields and just be observers. And then how do we interact? Well, that could be a very fearful experience. So we have to make a choice. So we could still start and offer a menu, but you know, we're on the hesitancy highway. So maybe what we have to choose is a selection of, well, cow words or chickens or suckers. And we still have to check out the soup du jour, because we have to have it daily. So we're constantly living in a state of fear. So our foodie body is coming the same way as the light. And the cow body comes the same way, except now the physical fingerprint is not a color spectrum, but it's a cow. Let there be a cow. And that becomes a gravitational confirmation. And so that's the cow's point of view. But what happens if we say, wait a second, let there be chicken? Now we have a chicken confirmation. And it too is a gravitational confirmation. So the chicken has to look after its foodie body. Then, of course, let there be fish. So then the fish has to have a body, and it has to be here through gravitational confirmation. And then, of course, well, let there be plants. So the plants have to have a gravitational confirmation. And now we have a point of conflict here, because let there be humanity. We have our gravitational confirmation. And from our point of view, our gravitational conformation is more important for our self-serving energy binding needs. So our selection dimension is a coming together of the matter state plasma, creating these matter state inertia fields, creating these matter state physicalities, creating these matter state gravitational stability fields, where we have the gravitationally stable cow, chicken, fish, and plant. And then we eat that stability to satisfy our selection dimension. So we're just, fudging foodies. We say you are what you eat. So we like to go to the foodie buffet. Are we just a buffet of foodies? Or sometimes we're dining on cows, chicken, fish, and plants. Or we look at cannibalism, which is dining on humanity. Why not? If you're dining on Earth space, problem with the Earth space foodie buffet, it only gives us 20% of the energy. But if we're dining on the outer space plasma buffet, we're getting 80% of our energy. Which would be true for the cows, the chickens, the fish, the plants, and the rest of humanity. So we're all taking energy from the lowest energy source, aren't we? And we're robbing it from others. And this becomes the dilemma for the farmer, taking great care to raise the cows, only to slaughter them. So we see that there's an energy sequencing as we go through, from the plasma science to the physical science. And, we go through various stages. And we start with the lowest energy state, which is magnetic, and then electric, and then electromagnetic, atomic, nuclear, advancing into the plasma state, and then the soul of the body and the soul of the man. And these are all in sequence, but not necessarily one step at a time. We can jump the steps. The point of the matter is that each step has a magnetical balancing between the fields of attraction, which are part of the feedback of the gravitational intensity, and the repulsion of the magnetical feeding, which is part of the outintensity. And so we see the neutron at the core and the electron on the periphery. However, they're both created the same way. So can you see the difference? We look at the core component of the electron coming together with the antimatter, dark matter, and matter state. And we call it magnetical because it's tiny. When we look at the neutron, we look at the core component of the antimatter, dark matter, and matter state, and it too is tiny, but way bigger than the electron. So when we look at the core components, we say, well, the neutron is gravitational, the electron is magnetical, and they're both created the same way. And you say, well, they're both tiny, but, one's really tiny and the other one is not so tiny or really big. And then you say, well, how big is it? Well, I don't know. It's really big, or it's really small, or, it's average. So we see that it's a two-way street. And so we say that, the combination of the attraction repulsion forces plus a magnetical outtensity is part of the natural creation, whereas the repulsion attraction forces plus the gravitational forces becomes part of the intensity, and we unfortunately call it natural decay. So the forces coming together as a maggrav plus the magnetical are represented by our emission forces. And the forces represented as the maggrav plus the gravitational forces, we call the absorption forces. And they go both ways. And then we see that as four-wheelers of a creation, we have to have a balanced field in the creation, which has the relationship between the natural creation and natural decay. But likewise, we have the relationship on the decay side of a balance between the natural creation and the natural decay. So we understand then that you can create destruction if you so choose. And that's why we're the four-wheelers of creation, is because we have our creation within another creation. And so our creation is an inner space containment, isn't it? And so our inner space becomes an inertia of the neutron, right? Because it's a balance, maggrav, between the natural creation forces of outtensity and the natural decay forces of the intensity. And in order to maintain that inertia field, there has to be a continuous emission and a continuous absorption. Because energy is always in motion. So the Earth space operates the same way. It has its own transmutation state where it brings together all the three dimensions and then either manifests into a plasma field or a physical field. And if we want to keep our feet firmly on the ground, then we have to have a physical field. But if we want to travel in outer space, then we can opt for the transmutation state, which still has the three dimensions, but it has the gravitational containment within the core. Is that core a neutron or a proton? And then what about that in-between state, that black hole transmutation state, where we see the light where the light is, but where the light isn't is black, it's dark. So what's on the other side? Can we see that? And why not? So transmutation state involves the relationship between two fields, which creates an inertia field. And we didn't say which state that inertia field is in. But what we are saying, that there is a substitution capable. In other words, where we can transfer the gravitational dominance, such as the cow has its gravitational state and stability. And unfortunately, when we butcher it, we transfer that to our gravitational stability. So at that point of substitution, the intensity of the cow equals 0, and so does the out density. But the gravitational conformation remains, because the gravitational conformation of the cow or the chicken dissolves, and our gravitational conformation remains, and in fact absorbs the gravitational conformation from the others. And that substitution point is within this black hole field. And so, since we can't see past that, then that's why we're still foodies. So how do we go one step beyond? And that's the question, because we see that we can go one step at a time. We can go through the atomic, the monatomic, polyatomic, and the plasma state field, and then go one step beyond. And if we can go one step higher, what happens if we go one step lower? You know, what happens when you get to the center of the Earth? What happens then? Since all forces are converging at that center, could be a big traffic jam. But, you know, fortunately, when we look at the Earth space, it too is like a foodie, isn't it? Because the elements are the Earth space food. And so, as we found in Sanya last year, that we could create gold. Not just gold GANs, but the gold itself. And we can create it wherever we want to create it, provided we create the same kind of restaurant for Earth space. So we can go beyond. So the roadmap to the plasma highway really shows this relationship of this 80-20 business, where we see the intensity feeding coming from the carbon-14 to the carbon-13 to the carbon-12. And then there's the out-density feedback, but we see that it follows a different path. And that difference between the intensity and the out-density is the difference between the 80% and 20%. So in order for us to get all the energy that we need to maintain our gravitational stability, we have to have it all. All includes all. And so whatever we're short, well, we're either going to stuff our bellies or we're going to go hungry. And so the planet has having the same problem. The plasma fields have the same problem. And what's interesting is that the speed of rotation will affect the transmutation transition. And so this becomes another important factor to take into account. And we don't see the speed of rotation of the Earth space, but the Earth space does. So the Earth space rotates, but we walk on the Earth space. But we rotate with it. And so that field of rotation creates the blue planet. And so in order to have a planet, we have to have the intensity and out-density balancing, gives us stability. And in order for us to maintain that stability, we should be at peace with the planet. Peace is a prerequisite. There are many field strengths on the dove of peace. And we have only begun, as we said, these are basic classes on the Kesh space plasma work. And we need to accumulate more research teams to do further research and bring peace and prosperity to this planet. And one of the ways that we've got to learn is through the transmutation process. And so we're all on a testing process, a training session, transmutation flight sessions, which are now going on February, March, and April. teaching us that the whole universe understands how to travel in outer space. But we have added knowledge to give. Because you see, with the transmutation, it's the law of conservation that governs the covalent, that's 2, the trivalent, that's 3, the tetravalent bonding attributes. And so the containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. And the soul of man cannot be abandoned and cannot be compromised. And so the color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the men. And this is the integrity of man. That is the true color. So when we're talking about the unity, it's a non-linear inertia unity, determined by path link and susceptibility, where we have the emission of our intention, of our attention, the emission of our attention, and the emission of our retention, right? Because this interacts to create our emission of intention. We do the best with what we know. But if we know better, it is our duty to change. And so this creates a balance of contention. This is the contention of equality. So our conduct should reflect that. And we should put the welcome mat out. One of the best ways is with our antenna, our internal antenna, which gives us the feeding and the feedback connection, where we get the feeding message and the feedback manifestation of the success of that message. And we can tune that transmission so we can affect that transition, where we select one force, which is magnetical, and balance it by the force selection of another gravitational force. And you say, well, wait a second, the selection is forced? Well, the balance is forced. And the thing is, the selection is forced because of the balance, right? So the resulting selections feed the Magrav manifestation. So the selection manifestation is predetermined. By choosing, you can choose the peace dome of intention. And so the emission of intention affects the standard folding deviation and leaves no room for war. The transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. It has to balance. And it brings you the greater oneness to transcend the limitations of nuclear science and our understanding. With only looking at the physical aspect, we're missing most of the show. And for 577 weeks in a row, we have been producing the Knowledge Seekers workshops to teach the world what all of us knew when we were born and somehow forgot. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. So we're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science, which you get to choose by signing the World Peace Treaty and signing it earnestly with your pen, with your soul, and with true feeling. And when we say the true feeling, don't fool yourself, because we're just four-wheelers in a three-dimensional feeding inertia. We have to understand there are no straight lines to connect the dots of the fields of inertia. And can man go into outer space without a peace dome? Not really. And is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? If that's how we choose. How do we impart the transition of energy states of inertia? We're just hungry travelers on the roads of inertia to the physical transmission dimensions. And that's why the plasma science is being delivered daily via the Peace Dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And that's the end of the lesson. I hope you enjoyed this meal.
Thank you, Alex. I've been trying to understand how these chaps work, the electron, neutron, and proton. Never mind starting to manipulate them. I think I'll leave that to Mr. Kesh at the moment. We know the products are available, but thank you for a beautiful sharing. And there's so much more to go in this whole process. Let's see if any of the participants, if you've raised any questions with them. We know it's late for some of our European friends, but anyone have any thoughts or comments or questions they'd like to make?